Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm Andrew Yang. I'm running for President of the United States in 2020 as a Democrat. And I came to this decision over the last number of years working on Venture for America in cities around the country, where I spent 7 years working in Detroit, Cleveland, St. Louis, Birmingham, New Orleans, and other cities around the country. And I have to say, it was a shock to me what was going on in much of the country, because I grew up here outside of the New York metro area and went to Exeter, where I think at least one person here went, and then Brown, and then Columbia Law. But I had never been to a lot of the country before I started Venture for America. And so when I was there, I was working with entrepreneurs, and we did help create several thousand jobs. I was awarded an ambassadorship in entrepreneurship by the White House. A movie was made about Venture for America that's now on Netflix. If you like movies about entrepreneurs, it's called Generation Startup. But while this was happening, I got this sinking feeling that even as we were helping these companies create jobs, technology was eliminating many, many more jobs. Where if you go to a place like Detroit or St. Louis, you see the aftermath of the decimation of manufacturing jobs. And then when Donald Trump became our president in 2016, that was the shock to the system that I needed to, where I saw that we were racing against a tide that we're not going to beat, frankly. That as we were creating 3,000 jobs in these cities, we were losing many more than that. It was like pouring water into a bathtub that has a giant hole ripped in the bottom. And so I started writing a book about the impact of technology on the workforce, and realizing that the reason why Donald Trump won the election in 2016, what reasons do you think, like why do you think Donald Trump won the election? Anyone want to shout something out? Anxiety, yeah, that's a pretty good one.
It's differentiation and the mass support from all different parts.
Yeah, he was different. This is true. So some of the most common reasons that people throw out in the media would be racism, Russia, Facebook, and the FBI. Something like that. But what I think most of you would agree with me, because, you know, and it's funny, I didn't decide to run for president to become the first Asian American to run for president, but I do think that we see things a little bit differently. So what I think you might agree with me on is that the economy is driving many of the cultural elements. And so what happened in the economy is that we got rid of 4 million manufacturing jobs in Michigan, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Iowa, Missouri, and all of those were swing states, and they all went to Donald Trump. That is the reason he's the president today. It's not immigrants, it's automation and technology. Donald Trump came in and said, immigrants are the problem, build a wall, I'll bring your jobs back, we're going to freeze time, we're going to turn time backwards. Really a bunch of garbage nonsense that you all look at and be like, oh, like that's silly. And we have to do the exact opposite of all of that. We have to push society forward. We have to help the economy accelerate. We have to make the government speed up here in the US. And the opposite of Donald Trump is an Asian man who likes math. So I was figuring all this out, and I have many friends in technology in Silicon Valley. And you know, we'd be sitting around talking about it and be like, hey guys, we know what we did to the manufacturing workers, we're about to do to the retail workers, the call center workers, the truck drivers, the fast food workers. Unfortunately, those are the most common jobs in the US economy. What proportion of Americans graduate from college?
30%.
Yeah, it's 32%. So if you think of the average American worker is not a college graduate. The average American worker has a high school education and 1 year of college. So then when you think about, okay, what do Americans do for a living? The most common jobs are retail, call center, food service and food prep, truck driving, manufacturing. Driving a truck is the most common job in 29 states. And my friends in Silicon Valley are working on making trucks that can drive themselves. And they tell me that they are 98% of the way there, and that in 5 to 10 years there'll be robot trucks on the highways. So then on the flip side, you have these 3.5 million Americans who drive trucks for a living. Average age 49, 94% male, average education, high school. One thing I say is that person you think is a truck driver, that's actually a truck driver. I mean, there's not some other type of truck driver. It's 49-year-old men with high school degrees. So they make $46,000 an hour right now. It's one of the best paid jobs you can get if you don't have a college education. So what do you all think their next job will be after they can't drive a truck anymore for a living? It's rhetorical because no one knows. No one knows what that job is going to be. And so then when I went to Washington, D.C. and said, guys, we're in the third inning of the greatest economic and technological transformation in the history of the world. What are we going to do about it? There's like no response among anyone in Washington about this. The only sane sounding response is we're going to educate and retrain Americans for the jobs of the future. That sounds almost reasonable. And then I said, guys, I looked at the studies as to how effective government-funded retraining programs are at retraining displaced workers. Do you all want to guess how effective those programs are on a percentage basis? You're smiling and laughing because you know the number is going to be really low. Like, what do you all think that number is? What percentage effectiveness do you think federally funded retraining programs actually have? 1, 5, 23. Yeah, it's about right. It's like 0 to 15%. Yeah, and fewer than 10% of workers qualify for retraining programs anyway. It's not like when a mall closes, there's an army of government officials being like, we're here to retrain you. Like, that doesn't actually happen. As the mall closes, they all go home. So when I said this to the folks in Washington, I said, guys, that's not an actual plan because we're terrible at it. And we don't even really try to do it at scale. And then they're like, well, I don't know what to tell you because that's my talking point. This has been a great meeting. Good luck, and the rest of it. So I was like, oh my gosh, is this country so out to lunch that its leaders cannot even acknowledge the fact that we're in the third inning of the greatest economic and technological transformation in human history? Yes, it is that out to lunch. And our leaders are that out to lunch. They're like fighting over things from the 60s and 70s. And so I said, oh my gosh, this country really, really needs a wake-up call. This country is fighting over nonsense while the most common jobs are about to disappear. And I learned this, again, by working for 7 years in the Midwest and the South. And so now I'm running for president to help wake America up to this reality. Say it is not immigrants, it is technology. We can't reverse time, we can only go forward. So I know I'm here to talk a little bit about Asian Americans in US politics, and I am the first Asian American man to run for president in the history of the country as a Democrat. That's an applause line, come on, a little love. And so I've learned a lot about what that means. So a little bit about me. My parents immigrated to this country in the 60s and met at Berkeley and met in graduate school and got together. Anyone here go to Berkeley? I'm sure there might be someone here, no? Yeah, you're nodding. So then my father then got a job at GE, and so I was born in Schenectady, New York, upstate. And my father was a physicist who generated 69 US patents over his career for GE and IBM. And so I tell people, it's like immigrants are really good because immigrants come over and get things done. And like my father generated 69 patents for American companies. That's a win, I would say, for the US. So I grew up in upstate New York and then went to some of the schools that you all went to. And I never imagined I would be running for president. I was certainly not some crazy kid being like, I'm going to be president one day. So if any of you are thinking that, like you're more advanced than I was. Like I was playing video games and just doing whatever Asian kids do in upstate New York. So now that I'm running for president, like I've learned more about the Asian American place in society. And one thing that scares the heck out of me is that this country is heading towards becoming majority minority by 2045. That's 27 years from now. And so there's a very happy notion in some quarters that the country will just become more tolerant as it gets more diverse. You just figure that math will take care of it. Because if you have enough people, everyone will just have to get along. Unfortunately, that is not really the way things play out if you look at historical examples. There are very, very few examples in human history of a dominant racial or ethnic group giving up its dominance over time. That actually is not normal. That's not normal behavior. And so if you look at what's happening right now in this country, you can see an increasingly insecure white majority becoming more and more hostile, truly. And who is going to be the boogeyman of the next 10 to 20 years? Who's going to be the great rival to the United States in the eyes of American society? China, that's right. And so what do you think the attitude is going to be over time for the shrinking, insecure white majority that's losing their jobs for, let's say, Chinese Americans or Asian Americans? I personally, I said to a group at Harvard, I think we're one generation away from falling into the same camps as the Jews who were attacked in a synagogue in Pittsburgh, like just a couple months ago. It's like we're probably one generation away from Americans shooting up a bunch of Asians saying, like, you know, damn the Chinese because there's a giant Cold War or even more with China. That is the great danger that I fear that my children are going to grow up in. I have 2 young boys, 6 and 3. They're American, I'm American. And Asian Americans historically have not been highly politically active or energized. Asian Americans vote at lower levels, they donate at lower levels. And because of this, the dominant political parties do not care about Asian Americans. They do not regard us as a very important constituency at all. They regard us as a low-level ATM, where they'll show up, take some pictures because we love pictures, get some money, leave, and then not have to care about it for quite some time. That is our place in American politics right now. And this is partially because of where we live. Where do we live? We live in like New York and California and places where, frankly, our votes are not going to tip anything. And there aren't so many of us. I'll tell you guys, if Asian Americans all lived in Iowa, we would be a very important voting bloc indeed. You know, because I'm going to Iowa next week for the 7th time, because in order to become president of the United States, you need to win Iowa. But everyone knows that Asian Americans, by the time you get to New York, like the votes don't matter, and we don't vote, we don't participate. And there's a notion that we don't lead, you know, that we're not leaders. So that is what I've discovered over this time. And this was not my initial purpose in running for president, but we need to change that very, very quickly. Because if we sit back and think, hey, America will stay stable and organized and reward hard work and we'll make money and like have a good time and not have to care about what happens outside of our doors, that attitude is going to stop working pretty quickly. Probably next 5 to 10 years, unfortunately. So we need to start getting very, very engaged and active and show the rest of the country that we can solve problems. We have our own vision. We have our own leadership. And so some of the things that I talk about when I talk to Asian American groups, some people find the fact that I'm running for president to be, you know, a little bit audacious or something like out of the natural order, let's say. And part of it is that, well, you know, I haven't been a senator or a governor or some other elected official. But I have many friends who back John Chung for governor of California. And one thing I suggest to Asian Americans, and I'm going to suggest to you all tonight, if we wait for it to be our turn, it will never be our turn. There is never going to be a point when someone looks over and says, oh, it's time for that Asian American senator or governor to run for president and be president. That's not the way this works at all. Like, we will never get there. The only way that we're going to actually have a seat at that leadership table, or in this case, on the debate stages of the Democratic primaries next May, the only way we get there is if we step up and say, we have a vision for this country, and it is just as powerful, just as important as anyone else's vision. Only way we get there. Number 2 is that we've been gifted a massive opportunity politically in this next cycle. So I just finished saying that the parties do not care about Asian American voters, because they generally do not. But in this cycle, California moved its primary vote up by a bit more than a month. And so this time, California votes 5th. The first state is Iowa. The second state is New Hampshire. The third state is Nevada. The fourth state is South Carolina. And then this time, the 5th state is California. So you're going to have a lot of people running for president as a Democrat, probably 20 to 25, including me. And it is not going to be resolved by the time they get to California. So this time, the way Asian Americans vote might actually determine who the president of the United States is. First time in decades. First time certainly that I can remember. So this is an opportunity for us to stand up and say what we think actually matters this time. And the third thing, and maybe the most important thing to many of you, how many of you are parents? I sense there's at least some parents in the room. Now, this is a little uncomfortable, but how many of you have the sense that Asian Americans are allowed to become this successful in the US, but we are not allowed to become this successful? There are at least some of you who believe that. I mean, there's a real message you get that that's the case. And I have been with the leaders of this country. I've been with President Obama and President Clinton and President Bush and like, a dozen senators and governors. And one of the things you learn when you spend time with them is that they are certainly no better than we are. I guarantee you guys that. That we are every bit as smart, certainly every bit as hardworking, every bit as innovative, every bit as patriotic, and every bit as loving as any other American. And that is what I'm going to demonstrate on the path to the presidency in 2021. Well, that's when you get sworn in. You win in 2020, they get sworn in 2021. And one joke I like to tell for Asian Americans is that we're going to make the White House the Gold House. So thank you all very, very much. Would love to take some questions, but feel really glad to be here with people who are definitely exceptionally politically engaged in this community. So thank you all very much.
So you didn't mention anything about basic income. Can you talk about how you came up with it? And we understand a lot of jobs are going away, but there's also the other side of the idea is there are going to be many more jobs getting created because the history has proven that every time some jobs go away, many other jobs get created. So I want to hear more about your basic income idea and where is the money going to come from to pay for all that?
Sure thing. So of course, new technology is going to create many, many new jobs that we cannot predict. But the issue is, will those jobs be accessible for the people that are being displaced? Will those jobs be in the same places? Will they be available to people of the same skill levels? And those answers are quite different. There are going to be many, many new jobs in New York and Seattle and Austin and San Francisco. Are there going to be many new jobs in Missouri and Iowa and South Carolina? Like very, very different pictures. It's just the allocations are not where they would need to be. And unfortunately, Americans are moving across state lines at lower rates than they have in decades. So what you'd hope would happen is that Americans are like moving to Seattle, finding jobs. That is not happening. Instead, Americans are staying where they are. They're doing drugs. They're killing themselves. And then our life expectancy in this country has declined for the last 3 years, which is unheard of in a developed country. Developed countries do not have their life expectancy decline for 3 straight years. The last time that happened in the United States of America was literally the flu pandemic of 1900. Like that's where we are right now. Like you actually have to look up the flu pandemic to see how bad things are going here in the US. And that's because the labor market's not adjusting. So my plan, as you suggest, Terry, is the freedom dividend, which is to give everyone in America $1,000 a month if you're an adult, 18 to 64. Seems dramatic. Seems expensive. But I've dug into the numbers, and it's actually much more affordable than you would think, in part because Americans are already spending about $800 billion on 126 welfare programs. So highly inefficient, very bad incentives attached to them. The big change you would need to make in order to pay for this freedom dividend, and I call it the freedom dividend because it tests much better with Americans with the word freedom in it, is that who are going to be the major winners from artificial intelligence and robotics and autonomous vehicles? Like, who are going to be the big winners? Yeah, which ones?
Amazon, Google.
The biggest tech companies, that's right. So it's Amazon, Google, Facebook, Uber, et cetera. Now, the trap that America's in is that those companies don't pay a lot of taxes. Amazon's move is to say, didn't make any money this quarter, no taxes. Google's big move is to say it all went through Ireland, no taxes in the US. And so the trap the American public is in is that these companies are going to soak up more and more work and more value, and the public's going to see less and less of it. So what we have to do in America is we have to join every other industrialized economy, including Europe, including China, like all the major countries already have a value-added tax. And a value-added tax would give the American public a sliver of every Amazon transaction, every Google search. And because the American economy is so vast at $19 trillion, up $4 trillion in the last 10 years, a value-added tax at even half the European level would generate more than $800 billion in new revenue. So that $800 billion, plus a majority of the $800 billion we already spend on existing welfare programs, plus the fact that you'd be dramatically enhancing the consumer economy. How many of you have heard this stat that 57% of Americans can't afford an unexpected $500 bill? You guys heard that? You've heard that, right? And what did you think when you saw that?
I didn't find it surprising.
You didn't find it surprising?
Because Americans are not known for their saving habits.
Yes. Well, one of the problems, too, is that their income volatility is up to very high levels. So they're having a hard time planning and budgeting. So if you put $1,000 in their hands, they're going to spend it. It's going to increase the size of the consumer economy. And then the government gets back about 25% of that in new revenue. It's going to create 4 million jobs. It's going to create many, many new companies. So you get some returns on that. And then you also save hundreds of billions on healthcare, incarceration, homelessness services, and you make your population healthier, mentally healthier, higher educated, higher graduation rates. So you add it all up, and you end up with about $2.4 trillion on both sides of the ledger. So this thing ends up being deficit neutral if you pass a value-added tax to harness the gains of new technology. It also has the major benefit of helping ease us through this incredible historic transition. Because one of the brutal facts about America is that we're the most heavily armed society in the history of the world. There are 300 million guns in this country. And we kind of know who owns most of them. And so if you don't have something like a basic income, you're going to end up with a really, really incredibly dark, violent, tumultuous time. And so this, I speak to CEOs about this, and I say, like, this is very pro-capitalist and pro-consumer because it helps the market transition from this stage to the next stage.
So yeah, thank you again for coming. I've got two questions, actually, both based on the speech you just gave. When you first talked about manufacturing jobs kind of leaving the U.S., do you think that the U.S. can do something similar to what Germany and what Japan might currently do, which is resist the technological change you talk about? Not reverse time, but try to stand against it with what German automobile OEMs do and with what German companies do, which is provide, or what Japanese companies do, which is provide almost lifetime employment in return for low wage. And the second question is on what you're talking about, on these insecurities that some Caucasian Americans might have. You're running in 2020. These insecurities are also, already kind of starting to show through the cracks in the wall.
Yep.
There's evidence of racially motivated crimes against Asian Americans. How are you going to deal with that? How are you going to deal with also the stigma surrounding socialism and your UBI plan?
Well, I think that was more than two questions, but no, I was kidding.
Three, kind of.
It's fine. So I guess I'll start at the back. The two states I need to win are Iowa and New Hampshire. And I'm going to break down the mechanics of Iowa because it's really, really fun. So you might be looking at me and be like, wow, interesting figure. Don't think he can compete with the people who have like hundreds of millions of dollars and like, name brand recognition and everything else. But I have to say, one of the fun things about the way we operate is we find the key variables and levers, and then we just try and make that happen. It's almost like a test. It's like we're really good at acing the test. So the test in this context comes down to Iowa and New Hampshire. So how many Iowans on a percentage basis? Iowa has a population of 3.1 million. How many Iowans do you think participated in the Democratic caucus in 2016? On a percentage basis, out of 3.1 million. 5.6. Only 170,000 of them. And so in order for me to compete and win the presidency, I have to win approximately 30,000 Iowans over to the idea that them getting $1,000 a month is a good idea. And that's where the rubber hits the road. All the rest of it doesn't matter. So this is a long-winded way of coming back to your question. Iowa is almost entirely white. It's like 94% white. If you're in an environment that's that predominantly white, your racial hostility towards Asians or any other group is almost non-existent. Because if you're in an environment that's that white, you just feel comfortable all the time. And then if like someone in another race comes and you're like, oh, that's cool, like, and then you just talk to them. Like I've been there now 6 times, going back for the 7th time, racial hostility non-existent. You need more non-whites in an environment for the racial awareness and hostility to like get up to a level where it's actually problematic. So when you say like, hey, how can you overcome being Asian American to become the president? Because of the nature of both Iowa and New Hampshire is also like almost entirely white, the racial hostility there is very, very low. It's really interesting. You can come up with me in campaign and see what I mean. So.
And you think that will remain true with everything that's going on with Huawei now? And, you know.
The average person in Iowa and New Hampshire has never heard of Huawei.
But the average person in Iowa watches Fox News, and Fox News is currently reporting on it almost every other night.
Virtually none of the 200,000, the 6% most Democratic progressive people in Iowa watch Fox News. So, and those are the only people you need to win. Again, you just got to focus on the actual test. There's all the noise, all the nonsense. It just boils down to, can you get 30,000 Democrats in Iowa, the most hardcore Democrats in the state, to vote for you based upon the fact that you want them to get $1,000 a month. And I've been there now 6 times, going back for a 7th. I can win. I can win the presidency because I can win 30 to 40,000 Iowans. A kid, Jonathan Herzog, I shouldn't say kid, it's like 20-something, like many of you, dropped out of Harvard Law School last month to move to Iowa for me because he sees the same thing. He's like, you're going to win, and we're just going to convince the Iowans that them getting money is a good deal. So, I mean, really, it's like, it's pretty powerful. You boil it down. So that's how you overcome the racial animus. And I will say, too, if you guys go online, there's a video of me speaking to 1,000 Iowans. And like I'm the only Asian person in that room, pretty clearly. But you'll see I get a standing ovation. And just the fact that I'm there can help elevate the perception of Asian Americans. Because if they look at me, they spend some time with me, they're like, what is that guy doing here? You know, and then it's like, he's either crazy or he's here to help. And then after you hang out with me for a little while, it's like they rule out crazy. And they're like, oh, this person's actually here to help. Like, I actually think that I'm improving their perception of Asian Americans just by being there. And that's one of the virtues of my run for the presidency. So that's a very long-winded way of answering the second part of your 2-part question. The first question, can you remind me?
Yeah, it's whether or not we can resist the change.
Yeah, whether or not we can resist the change. So I'm a huge admirer of the German system for many reasons. So the big change that the US could make, that the Germans have already made, that have helped create many, many jobs that are steady and stable, is that they've invested in a massive apprenticeship and technical and vocational track where 59% of German high school students have some degree of technical training in high school. In the United States of America, that percentage is 6%. We're at a very, very small fraction of it. We have unfortunately stigmatized that form of labor. We've said, go to college, everyone go to college is the jam, and it's been a disaster. Where the college completion rate in the United States is down to 59%, indebtedness is sky high. You have all these kids going to college who should not be going to college in this country. And so that is the change we have to make to try and mirror the Germans, where we have to try and destigmatize middle skill labor, because that's where a lot of the opportunities actually are in this country. There are about like 15 million unfilled middle skill jobs, and many of those jobs are actually harder to automate. It is very, very hard to automate away an air conditioning repair person. It's much easier to automate away like an accountant than it is an air conditioning repair person. So we have to start pushing Americans toward the more resilient opportunities, and that's what the Germans have already done.
So I also have 3 questions. Sorry, I don't want to hog the mic, but one is pretty easy. Would you consider extending the freedom dividend to family members, so like moms and dads, so they have more money to spend on their children than to a single man? That's my first question. My second question would be, what would your policy be towards immigration? And then my third question would be, how would you handle the opioid epidemic that is, facing Middle America?
Sure. So the first one, there are existing programs that tend to advantage parents and like people with children more, and so I'm hoping the freedom dividend can just be uniform, because I think the simplicity and elegance is very, very powerful. to immigration, it'll probably surprise none of you that I'm very pro-immigrant. And again, I tell the story about my family. So one of the big advantages of the US over the last number of generations has been that we've competed for talent, like many of you here in this room. Like you've thought, hey, if I can go anywhere, I'm going to go to America, because America's got the best opportunities, the richest, best schools, like all this great stuff. And if we keep winning on that level, then this country can stay strong for a long time. If we start losing on that level, then this country is going to slide very, very quickly. And so, again, I'm the opposite of Donald Trump. So Donald Trump's like, stay out, build a wall. I'm like, if you come to this country and get a diploma, we're going to staple a green card to every diploma, because it makes absolutely no sense to educate you and then send you back to your own country where you have to, like that's stupid. Now, I'm pro-immigrant also for undocumented immigrants, where we need to create a path to citizenship that's very long, very protracted, multi-year, pay taxes, stay clean, but eventually we need to integrate them into the formal economy, because having 12 million Americans, or 12 million people who are here undocumented who are having American children, is not sustainable over time. We essentially have created this weird shadow economy where there's all sorts of use and abuse, and so we need to formalize their inclusion in society and really enforce the borders, because you can't have open borders in a situation where you're starting to integrate new citizens on that level. So that's immigrants. On the opiate issue, I mean, I think most of you probably do not realize just what a plague opiates are in this country, where 8 Americans are dying of drugs every hour. And it's a plague that was facilitated by the federal government. They turned a blind eye when Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family just started dispensing opiate prescriptions like candy, where there was one point where there were more opiate prescriptions than people in the state of Ohio, as an example, just like opiates everywhere. And this one company actually profited to the tune of $20 billion. They're now the 16th richest family in the country, and they have their name on libraries and buildings in Harvard and Yale, the Sackler family. And the whole thing is incredibly disgusting and immoral. Like they've literally just profited to the tune of tens of billions by killing many, many Americans, and the plague just keeps on ripping holes in American communities. So to me, it's the federal government's responsibility to legitimately try and counteract that and just put essentially unlimited resources into addressing opiate addiction, which is really hard to address even if you have a lot of resources, because it's just very, very hard to get off opiates. Like even if the success rate of treatment is hit or miss. Like some people have to go into rehab 5 times. So it's going to be with this country for a long, long time. But to me, it's a federal responsibility because the feds let it happen in the first place.
I was wondering, so since we're doing multi-part questions, I'll keep it sort of short, but I was wondering what you think Donald Trump would identify as your biggest weakness and how you would respond to that, and sort of your general plan for if you were to secure the nomination for the party for beating him.
So we have a guess in the office as to what his nickname for me would be. And we've come up with Comrade Yang. And so we think like the easiest way to dismiss me would be like, oh, he's like a Chinese socialist, like, trying to do un-American stuff, that sort of thing. I think that's like the easiest way to try and dismiss me. I'm very confident I would beat Donald Trump if I were the nominee. Because if you look at the way the map played out, Hillary Clinton won the popular vote by several million. And in order to beat Donald Trump, all I need to do is peel off approximately 5 to 10% of his voters and supporters. And having spent time in these places around the country, many Trump supporters have come up to me and said, I voted for Donald Trump and I will vote for you. Because you're a true outsider, you're an entrepreneur, you want to shake things up, you want to solve the problems. A lot of Donald Trump's appeal was just that he actually acknowledged the problems in these communities. If you remember the argument, Donald Trump was like, things are going terrible for these people, like jobs are gone, it's terrible. And then Hillary's response was literally, don't let anyone say that they'll make America great again because America's already great. It's like those problems are not really problems. And the anger is justified in many of these communities because, again, we blasted away 4 million manufacturing jobs. So just the fact that I'm going into these places and being like, guys, I get it. We have devastated your communities, and my goal is to build a new human-centered economy from the ground up, from your families up, from your communities up, and I am the man of abundance. $1,000 for everyone, and let's move toward the future. That might not get me 80%, of the people that voted for Donald Trump, but that'll get me 10%, and that's all I need to win. You know, I also want to quote Donald Trump on this. So Donald Trump was at a rally in West Virginia, and people were asking about the various Democrats he's going to run against. And he was like, I cannot wait to run against all of those people. And then he said, the only thing that worries me is that some new person comes out of nowhere. That's the only thing I worry about. And then I got a dozen emails being like, he's talking about you. Yes?
I'm trying to be devil's advocate. So you were talking about unemployment, losing jobs, but the U.S. now has like less than 4% unemployment rate. So how do you reconcile this? This is one question. Another thing is related to opioid. If you give people the money, the universal income, so how can you guarantee the money is not used for opioids for the drugs? Yeah. I mean, right now there are people who have lots of time and all they do is try to grab money whenever they can to feed them all the opioids. In contrast, is that, okay, giving people probably a job is more important than giving people the money. Because the job not only brings money, it brings identity, which is very important. So that's the second question. The third one is so giving people is only one thing, but the social network securities has more to do with the healthcare. So it's like lots of people live on healthcare, on the social security, and now you give them extra money, income. So that is like a huge deficit on the budget. So that's a third thing.
No. Let's see if I remember. I always remember the last one because it's easiest. So the United States spends twice as much on its healthcare as other industrialized countries to worse results by the numbers. We have a very messed up healthcare system where if you get sick or injured, you're more stressed out about navigating the bureaucracy and paying for it than you are trying to get better. It's so terrible here. And so there's so much money in the system that it's going to be a massive. So I'm for single-payer healthcare, Medicare for all. Because 94% of new jobs don't have healthcare coverage anyway. They're like temporary gig contractor jobs. It doesn't make sense to tie it to employment anymore. That system never made sense. Like no other country is like, oh, you have a job and you like healthcare. Like, you know, it doesn't make any sense. So that's number one. Your first question about the headline unemployment rate. The headline unemployment rate measures the number of people who are in the workforce who are looking and can't find a job. So that number is like 3.7%, as you say. Multi-decade low, very, very rosy. What it does not include is that the labor force participation rate in the United States, which is how many people are actually in the workforce, is down to 62.9%, the same levels as El Salvador and the Dominican Republic, and a multi-decade low. 1 in 5 prime working age American men between the ages of 21 and 30 has not worked in the last year. Now, none of that figures into the unemployment rate because as soon as you leave the workforce, then it actually improves the unemployment rate because you're no longer in the workforce looking. And what's funny is Donald Trump said exactly the same thing I'm saying while he was running for office, and then he just stopped saying it when he became president, but none of the stats changed. There's still 94 million Americans who are out of the workforce. And again, so here are some of the stats. Labor force participation rate, multi-decade low. Life expectancy declined for 3 years. Suicide rates, sky high. Marriage rates, record low. 40% of American children born to an unmarried mother, record high. Like, you know, like any indicator you look at shows that this society is disintegrating. And the headline unemployment rate is essentially government misinformation at this point. It's just a terrible, terrible measurement. And people just keep using it. So this country has 3 major economic measurements. GDP, which is also terrible. And one of the comments I make is that my wife is at home with our 2 boys, one of whom is autistic. What does GDP value her work or contribution at? 0. What does the monetary market value her work at? 0. But I know that she's working much harder than I am, you know, and she's doing something much more important. And so GDP is a terrible measurement that's actually leading this country into ruin because everyone just worships GDP. When the trucks drive themselves, that's going to be great for GDP. It's going to be very bad for the truck drivers and then the 5 million Americans who work in truck stops, motels, diners. So if you look at the social indicators, it's all going to the toilet. The other major economic indicator is stock market prices. Guess what percentage of stock market wealth the bottom 80% of Americans own? It's like 8%. And then the bottom 50% own 0. So if you talk about stock market wealth, you're talking about something that affects the top 20% of Americans. The bottom 80% essentially see none of that. So these are like really this country has a major measurement problem. And it has not updated its measurements in decades. It invented GDP during the Great Depression. It's like almost 100 years ago. So one reason why someone like me is necessary for this country is that I can like update the measurements. Like that would literally be like the greatest service you could actually do to this country is just update them to more rational, human-centered measurements to give people a sense of how we're doing. And that's one of my platform elements, as you'd guess. So I think I got your questions, right? Did I miss one? Oh yeah, oh right. So the other central problem you had is like, look, people need work. Universal basic income does not give them work. Jobs are better than money. That's like the basic thrust of it. And I agree with all of that. People do need work. Jobs are better than money. The problem is that the US government, and most any government, would be a miserable failure at trying to create jobs for this many people that were not truly terrible, abusive, exploitative. It's like that old story about, I think it was Milton Friedman, who was in China, when there was a construction site. Lonnie, you know the story, where like there were just a bunch of guys with shovels instead of bulldozers and tractors. And the guy went over and said, where are all of the tractors? And then the government official said, like, no, this is a jobs program. So we don't want to give them any equipment. And then Friedman looked at it and said, then why give them shovels? So that's where the US government would head if it was just like, hey, it's time to create jobs for everyone. Because the US government would end up creating all of these makeshift jobs that don't really make sense. And then if the population of the US was then dependent on the government for those jobs, the best way to create jobs in this country is by putting money into the hands of Americans who would then spend it on car repairs, restaurants, tutoring for their kids, and then all of those businesses would then create the jobs that you're looking for, and then they would hire the Americans. That's the best way to create jobs in this country. People have it wrong. It's like, hey, if I give them a job, that'll give them money. The American government would be unable to do that. The only thing the American government is able to do is give them the money, and then the economy would then create 4 million jobs.
Sure. I understand that primaries in the United States tend to be very domestic issue heavy, but I suspect that if you survive the primary stage, which I honestly hope you do, some of those debate fora will ask you foreign policy questions, and I think that because for Asian Americans, like the first question on the tip of their tongues will be, how will you deal, or what is your position on China and, say, a Taiwan contingency?
Sure. So I agree. After I get through the primary and become the nominee, then foreign policy will be a much more significant issue as I become a contender. But one of the things that I'm very confident about in terms of foreign policy and the rest of it is that, and you saw this with Obama, is that what they want to do is they want to see that you're a thinker and have judgment, and you're just not going to do something stupid. And I'm going to suggest that if I do well enough where I get through the primary and become a major contender, Americans will have developed some degree of confidence just in my overall judgment. They're not going to care about my, like recall of foreign president names and the rest of it. I will say that, and I can memorize those things pretty quickly because I'm pretty good at that stuff. But in terms of my principles, like I actually wrote an op-ed that's going to come out next week that China is not America's enemy. And one of the major problems we're facing right now is that there are a lot of people in America that want to cast China as America's enemy. And it's crazy. Like it's like the two biggest economies in the world, like both nuclear powers, we could destroy each other like in half a dozen different ways. Like so, trying to do anything but try and like find common ground with China is like a really stupid policy moving forward. And my general stance on foreign policy is that America has gotten itself into a lot of misadventures because it had grandiose visions of what it could accomplish, and it cannot accomplish most of those things. I'm all into restraint of American power. One of my thoughts is that anytime we declare military action, there should be one child of a congressperson randomly chosen to go with the armed forces. Because it strikes me as immoral just to say that we're going to go do this if like at least none of our kids is on the line. I mean, then you'd see more rational foreign policy. So I have time for one last question. So someone, you had your hand up for a little bit. Go ahead and ask a question. Plus, your people who sit in the front too. It means like they're right there and engaged. Go ahead.
My question for you is, in case Bloomberg really go for presidency, what's your plan of beating? Sure.
Well, first, thank you so much, Claire. It's a beautiful sentiment. And for anyone here who'd like to see me on the debate stage, I need your support. I need your help. So please do go to yang2020.com, Google, just spread the word, contribute, because I need your help. So Mike Bloomberg is a great American leader and entrepreneur. He is going to struggle in Iowa mightily, because people in Iowa do not relate to that guy at all. And and Claire can share her opinion on that. It's like, hey, how do you think Mike Bloomberg would go over in Iowa? So again, you have to look at the actual mechanics of how you become president. Mike Bloomberg has unlimited resources, will command a lot of respect. But how many people are going to donate their money to Mike Bloomberg? Very, very few, because they're like, that guy's worth $30 billion. He doesn't need my 10 bucks, right? And then when you go to Iowa and say, hey, this is Mike Bloomberg, multi-billionaire, Wall Street guy. They're going to be very, very skeptical, very, very dubious. The same thing is true in New Hampshire. It's really interesting, the mechanics of this democracy, where you think if you're in New York, you have this system where it's just dominated by money. And it's generally true. It is dominated by money. But then you get to Iowa, you get to New Hampshire, and they do not care about any of that. They want to spend time with you. They want to meet you. They want to size you up. And if you were, I'm just going to guess, if you were a 76-year-old multi-billionaire from New York, they're not necessarily going to say oh, this guy is definitely going to be our next president. So he's going to struggle. You're going to see it. Though I like Mike, great man, great American, great entrepreneur, great leader, but he is not someone that I think is going to perform well in this process. And with your help, hopefully I can perform well in this process. So thank you all very, very much. Really appreciate it. Thank you.